So today we're diving into something pretty radical. It's an academic argument that really challenges the story many of us know about Ethiopian history. The usual narrative, right, is that the Abyssinian Empire was this incredible, homegrown African power that stood strong against European colonialism. But the author of this text asks a pretty explosive question. What if that very empire was a colonial state itself? A settler colonial state? Let's really get into that claim. And it all kicks off with this really powerful quote from an anthropologist named Patrick Wolfe. This idea is the absolute bedrock for the entire text we're looking at today. It's simple, but it's deep. The idea is that some invasions aren't just a battle or a war that ends. Instead, they build a whole new system, a structure that's designed from the ground up to replace the people who were there first. And that leads to the huge question this text poses. What happens when you take this theory, which we usually hear about in places like the Americas or Canada or Australia, and you use it as a lens to look at the history of the Abyssinian Empire? It's a really provocative question, and the author's answer is exactly what we're going to explore. Okay, so before we can really get into the author's main argument about Abyssinia, we've got to get our heads around this core idea. So what exactly is settler colonialism, according to this text? So the text makes it really clear this isn't the kind of colonialism we might normally think of. It's a very specific flavor where the main goal is permanent replacement. The settlers, as Patrick Wolfe said, come to stay. They're not just there to rule from a distance. They're there to build their own new society right on top of the old one. And this is where the author really draws a line in the sand. You see, classic colonialism is usually about extraction. Shipping resources and using local labor to make a mother country far away rich. But settler colonialism, that's about replacement. The number one prize is the land itself. And that means the whole game changes. You're not trying to manage the native people for profit anymore. The goal becomes displacing them, and in the end, eliminating their society. Right, and this brings us to a really key idea in the text, the logic of elimination. The author argues that even though things like race or religion are often used to justify it, the real fundamental driver is the hunger for territory. And elimination here doesn't always have to mean physical genocide, though it can. It's more about dissolving the native societies, getting rid of their political structures, their cultures, their claims to the land, all to clear the way for the new settler society to take root. Okay, so we've got the theory down. Now let's see what happens when the author actually applies this lens to the history of Abyssinia, starting right at the very beginning. And, this is where the argument starts to get really, really controversial. Here's the author's central claim. The people who founded the Abyssinian kingdom, the Habesha, were not actually native to the Horn of Africa. The text argues they were immigrants, nomads from the Arabian Peninsula who crossed the Red Sea. And over centuries, they mixed with the local Cushitic groups, creating a new, blended culture, and eventually started a long process of dominating and pushing out the very people who first took them in. And to back this up, the author actually looks at the word itself. The text argues that the name Abyssinia comes from the Arabic word al-Habsha, which means something like a mixture or a collection of different peoples. The author uses this to suggest that the name itself points to a history of being a mixed group, not a single indigenous people with a clear line back in that specific region. So, how does a group of immigrants supposedly end up dominating an entire region? Well, according to the author, this wasn't some peaceful, organic process. It was enforced using some pretty powerful tools of empire. And it started with maybe the most powerful tool of all, religion. The author points to the adoption of Christianity back in the 4th century as this huge political turning point. It wasn't just a spiritual change, it became an ideological weapon, a tool for conquest. The text even calls it a form of necropolitics, which is a fancy way of saying it gave the state the power to decide who gets to live and who has to die, all wrapped up in the banner of a holy mission. And to really hammer this home, the author doesn't just theorize. They pull a quote directly from the chronicle of King Ezana himself, the very ruler who converted the kingdom to Christianity. And his own words are chilling. He talks about burning towns, killing people, looting everything. It's a brutal description that the author argues is a world away from a simple spiritual mission. So you have the military side, but what about the economics? Well, that military power was funded by something the author calls the Guffel system. Now, this wasn't like paying your taxes. It's described as this constantly moving predatory system where armed groups would just show up in a region, take everything of value, slaves, cattle, crops, you name it, and they'd only leave when there was absolutely nothing left to take. And the analogy the author uses is, wow, it's pretty intense.
They say that for the farmers and peasants on the ground, these roving gangs of soldiers weren't a government. They were seen as a plague, like a swarm of human locusts that would just descend and devour everything in their path. Okay, so that's the ancient history. But how does any of that connect to the Ethiopia we know today? Well, the author's whole point is that this system never really went away. It just got a modern makeover and was locked into place in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Let's look at this timeline from the source. It highlights a few key moments. First, you've got 1884, when European powers bizarrely treated Abyssinia like a fellow player in the scramble for Africa. Then, in 1923, the nation joins the League of Nations as Abyssinia. But then, boom, just a few years later, in 1931, something really significant changes. So why the name change? According to the author, this was a brilliant and deliberate political move. The argument is that by taking the name Ethiopia, which is an old Greek term for a much wider, almost mythical African civilization, the state was trying to hide its specific Abyssinian settler identity. Instead, it could claim a much older, more indigenous, and even Pan-African heritage. And this is where it all comes together. The author's final argument is that this whole structure, created centuries ago, modernized 100 years ago, isn't just history. It's the living, breathing foundation of the region's conflicts and politics today. The past, as they say, isn't even past. So let's just pull all the pieces of the author's argument together one last time. Abyssinia is reframed not as a native African empire, but as a settler colonial state started by immigrants. Its expansion, the author says, was driven by that logic of elimination to get land. Religion was the justification, and that predatory Gamma fall system was the engine. And the final, crucial point is that the modern state of Ethiopia inherited this entire structure, top to bottom. You know, the text we've just walked through presents a single, very critical, and very controversial story. But it leaves us with a much bigger question, one that goes way beyond this one case. How powerful are the stories that nations tell about themselves? How much do those origin stories, the ones we learn in school and tell our children, actually shape who we are today and who we're going to be tomorrow?